We are now live. Don't be afraid of the rhino coming towards you. Welcome, everyone. This is Dwight Hurst coming at you on YouTube, not live, with the DBT workshops. I think this is the 10th one. It could be the 11th. I'm bad at counting. These because I always forget till after I started to look up what the last one's number was. So this is one of those. We are now working in the section of interpersonal effectiveness with our DBT skills, and this workshop is no exception to that. And we're going to be talking about one of those skills today. Today, we are actually going to be discussing the D.E.A.R.M.A.N skill. D.E.A.R.M.A.N, you remember that character from He-Man? So, no, not that. Not some kind of weird superhero called D.E.A.R.M.A.N. We are going to talk about the skill of D.E.A.R.M.A.N, D-E-A.R. It's as if you were writing a letter to a person and you were saying, "Dear man," because you didn't know this person's name and they were male, I guess. Who knows? It's an acronym. In case you hadn't figured it out by now, DBT is lousy with acronyms. So that's what it is. It's an acronym that stands for describe, express, assert, reinforce, be mindful, have the appearance of confidence, and negotiate. You might notice that the commitment to acronyms extends pretty far on this one. They're really trying to have it say "Dear Man." So in the word "man," you have mindful, which is really be mindful while communicating. You have appearance is the A, which is appearance of confidence, and then N is negotiate. So there you go. Describe, express, assert, reinforce, remain mindful, have the appearance of confidence, and negotiate. Those are the principles that you should keep in mind for D.E.A.R.M.A.N. Thanks for watching today. Haha, just kidding. I'm going to talk about them. Ready? Okay. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go through each one of them and talk about how they relate. This is one of the things that emphasizes what I was talking about last time, which is the underlying principles of DBT, how they kind of build on each other, and they're all interrelated. So when we're talking about mindfulness, as we did videos on that, core mindfulness, you remember, you've committed them all to memory by now, I'm sure. And so, yeah, mindfulness is something that crops up again and again and again, both as a coping skill and as just a way to live your life. And now we're going to see how it plays into dealing with other people. So let's dive in, shall we? We'll start with describe. You may also recognize this from such DBT instructional videos as one that I did, the how skills, I believe, or was it the what skills? Yeah, the what skills. Describe is actually a distress tolerance technique as well, describing what's going on. And here's the thing to remember when you are describing. Just like if you're using it to deal with personal stress, description is a list of things that are happening currently. That's it, what's happening currently. And so D.E.A.R.M.A.N applies to when you're going to be having to talk to another person, particularly if you're having to talk to them about something that's difficult to discuss. You want to keep D.E.A.R.M.A.N in the back of your head, or even, I don't know, write it down or review it beforehand before you have a difficult conversation. And so description gives you a couple of different tools that you can do. All right, so you can describe to the person that you're talking to what it is that you want to talk about. Say, hey, I'd like to talk to you about this thing. That's a description. That's very simple, but it's good to keep in mind because one of the most difficult things about difficult conversations is how to start them. It's one of the things people talk the most about in communications training, and the thing that people ask the most when they're asking for any kind of communications advice. How do I broach a difficult subject? Just use description. Describe to the person, hey, I have a need and I need to talk about that. A couple other ways that you can apply this. You can also describe what is currently happening. One of the things that often happens in difficult conversations is we get bogged down with heated emotions and sometimes even fights, and depends on the nature of what we're talking about, but that can get us off topic and get us away from what we're saying. You can always, if you get stuck for something to say, you can describe to the person what's happening. You can say, hey, please don't raise your voice to me. That's a description of what's happening right now. I don't feel like we're really seeing eye to eye right now. That's a description. Description is something you can use not only to start the conversation, but throughout the entire conversation, in other words. And if you ever feel stuck, you can always, there's a go-to trick of what they call restatement, of where you say back to someone what they just said. Describe to them what they just said to you. Yeah, say, hey, it sounds like you don't agree with me about that. Well, I mean, that sounds silly, but actually what happens when you do that is the other person will usually either agree with you and add more information or disagree with you and clarify. And so describing what's happening, describing what you want to talk about, or describing back to them what you think they're telling you are all really good ways to use the skill of describe. And a key part here with description is to try to keep your description non-offensive and fact-based. A lot of times our emotions get mixed up into our description. For example, if I'm to describe to someone, hey, I want to talk to you because you humiliated me the other day. That's a description, certainly, but it may not be as effective as actually describing, hey, I want to talk to you about that specific thing that you said when we were both at work together. That's less accusatory and it is more descriptive. If I tell someone, I want to talk to you because you're a big stupid jerk, that is not very descriptive. It lets them know where I'm at emotionally, but it also puts them immediately on the defensive. And it's very, very subjective. If I say to someone, hey, I want to talk to you about something that happened that I don't like, or something you did that I don't like, and I specifically say it, that is descriptive. Dragnet is an example that very few people will get. It's an old TV show, and it was about police, and it was one of the first boring police procedurals that was aired on TV. Joe Friday, I think, was the name of the main officer. I used to watch these reruns when I was a kid, and he had a famous line where whenever he'd interview people, he'd say, just the facts, sir, or ma'am, depending on if he was talking to a man or a woman. He would vary the pronouns according to that. But he would always say, just the facts. We only want the facts. We are only interested in the facts. And that's a good thing to keep in mind while you're describing. It's a fact-based description, something that happened, something that didn't happen. You're very specific about that. Makes it less accusatory. So expressing things, that's the next part. So here's the thing. When they say express, I'm gonna just tell you what to think instead. That doesn't work as well in the acronym, which is clarity. Expressing something means telling someone clearly what it is that's going on, what the situation is. One of the examples that they'll often give, because D.E.A.R.M.A.N is often used when you're asking for something, is a raise. If I'm to express myself clearly to the other person, I might go to my boss and say, hi, I want to talk to you about my salary. That would be a description. And I might lead into expressing my feelings. I have been working here and I think that I deserve a raise. I'm clearly telling you right off the bat, this is what we're talking about and this is what I want. I'm not trying to embellish or convince you necessarily. What I'm going for is I'm going for direct clarity. Another thing you can always express, of course, is emotions when you're talking. So in expression, I can express the situation that we're talking about, but I can also clearly express to you what it is that I'm feeling. If I'm angry, for example, I could say, well, I'm feeling angry right now. It's very simple, sounds almost easy, but that's one of the things that one of the simple, easy communication techniques that go right out the window when we become emotional. Instead of me saying, you're a stupid jerk, like earlier, I could say, you know, when you talk to me that way, I feel disrespected. It's much more clear. I am expressing my feelings. One of the things that's important with this, because this is a therapy coping technique, some people make the mistake of thinking that this has to be nice. D.E.A.R.M.A.N is not always a nice experience. It's not always fun to go up to someone and say, hey, I think I deserve a raise, and I don't think you want to give me one. Let's talk about it. Or to have a conflict with someone or try to resolve something that is difficult. It's not always fun. Sometimes I'm expressing emotions that are fundamentally thought of as negative emotions. They're unpleasant emotions that I'm telling you about. And so that's not always easy, but expressing the emotion clearly is something that can help us to keep on track. So that's what you keep in mind with expression. A lot of the things in DBT communication skills, particularly in D.E.A.R.M.A.N, are designed to help us stay on track instead of losing ourselves over to becoming flooded with emotion. So assert. Now this is another one. It's a good example of how things are not always just cozy, nice, woohoo, bed of roses kind of communication. Asserting is basically boundaries. When you think assert, think of keeping my own boundaries. Think of spelling it correctly. There we go. Think of your boundaries. Say yes or no with clarity. Express those boundaries to people according to what they actually are. Don't say yes when you mean no, or no when you really could say yes, that kind of a thing. That you have that. You tell them clearly what it is that you want. This is thought to be, asserting yourself is really the opposite of kind of beating around the bush. If I go up to someone and say, hey, I have worked here for a long time, and how do you think that my job performance is? And okay, and you know, do people typically make what I make here? Do they always have the same salary as me? And I'm being very indirect, and I'm not telling you what it is exactly that I want. I'm saying, hey, I think I deserve a raise. Let's talk about that. I'm asserting myself. And if you come back at me with something else and we want to argue about some other thing, part of my boundary could be, hey, wait, I wanted to talk about this raise. I don't want to talk about that old Dragnet show you used to watch on TV and Sergeant Joe Friday and how he used to say just the facts, ma'am or sir, depending on if he was talking to a man or woman. I want to talk about my raise thing. Let's do that, please. You're asserting yourself. You're also, this goes back to expression a little bit, but you're clearly expressing your needs in the conversation. I need to find this out. Can you explain to me? If you say to me, no, you can't have a raise, I could assert myself by saying, well, I think I deserve one. Can you explain why I don't? I'm not just going to walk away and say, okay. I'm going to actually push the issue enough to say I have some boundaries here and I have some needs. And that's assertion. See how we're cooking through these? Seems like there's a lot of them. 7 to be exact, but yeah, good things to keep in mind. Reinforcing. Okay, so reinforcing means to reward, basically. Reinforcing, not just reinforcing, you might think it means reinforce your position, but what it actually means is that you want to reward or reinforce the person that you're talking to, the other person in the conversation. Other being the key word there. Not just myself. I'm reinforcing the other person. When you're going into a tough conversation with someone, one of the greatest communication things to keep in mind is to remember that this is probably not easy for them either. And if there's anything that I can give them, one of the greatest forms of reinforcement is agreement, for example. If someone is taking an opposite position to me, it's great to, in my mind, look for things that I can reinforce, reward, or agree with of what they're saying. If my boss says, well, you know, we're really strapped for cash here in this business, in this industry, we just don't have any money available. I'm not allowed to make those kind of discretionary budgetary decisions or whatever. You're starting to make excuses and say things. I might inside be feeling frustrated, start to get flooded with emotion. But if I'm looking for something I can reinforce, I could say, hey, I appreciate that he's telling me this. He's not just saying, no, get out of here. You shouldn't be asking. He's actually sharing some reasoning with me instead of just getting angry and brushing me off. So I could say, I really appreciate you telling me that. Now, honesty is a big important part of this. You don't want to reinforce something that you disagree with or something that you don't actually feel is good. Thanks for being, honest with me when you really feel like he's being condescending. Don't do that. Don't make up stuff. That's going to backfire. Look for something you can honestly agree with or honestly thank the person for. And that expression, there's psychological studies just out the wazoo that show that expressions of gratitude actually contribute to happiness. And so if we can express that within a conversation, especially a difficult conversation, that can help it go a lot further towards getting resolved. So look for things you can reward or reinforce. I found when I worked as a counselor at a college, I was sometimes called upon to be the ombudsman type of person where I had to work out conflicts that had arisen between students and faculty. And I learned very quickly that I needed to prep the faculty. That if I was going to come into a meeting where there was like any kind of contention between a teacher and a student, I needed to go to the teacher first and say, hey, look, part of the way that I do things is I'm going to look for things to reinforce with the student. Because the danger was if I just went in cold and the student would say, I'm really angry, I would say, sounds like you're really angry. And the danger was, and that sounds just stupid. It's like I'm not only restating or describing what they said, like we said earlier, but I'm also reinforcing. It sounds like you're angry. I know what you're talking about a little bit. I don't like that kind of feeling. That's frustrating. That sounds very frustrating to me, what you're expressing. I'm reinforcing something. I'm trying to validate or agree with something that I can agree with. The reason I'm doing that is so that they don't feel like they're alone, and then they're more likely to be willing to talk to me and to listen. It sounds silly and stupid, but it was so powerful that it actually would backfire, and the teacher would start to think, oh, Dwight just agrees with them. He thinks they're completely right, and I'm a big pile of garbage, or whatever hyperbole they would engage in. So I had to go and say, hey, I'm going to agree with whatever I can as a way to help reinforce them, make them feel valid, so that they'll feel safe, and then we can all talk without it becoming a big fight. And in fact, when I did that and prepped them, I noticed they started to do it too. One of the things that we all want to feel is we want to feel validated. And so if you're having a difficult conversation with somebody and you can find ways to validate them, it will often trigger them to want to do the same to you. And in these confrontations, the person we were talking to would often go, yeah, I mean, I know I'm frustrated, but I know you must be frustrated because of the way I handled it or whatever. And then all of a sudden, we're really talking to each other. It's just something to keep in mind. If you want to be reinforced, reinforce them too. Now, predatory, awful people, I'll put a little footnote here, are not going to reinforce you back. So don't expect that this will change a predatory, abusive, or manipulative person. This is when you're talking to someone, it's just a good thing to try. And if it doesn't work, then it doesn't work. You're moving on to something else. So we're moving on from dear to man, which is a separate word, kind of. It doesn't really matter that it's a separate word, but now we're getting to where the acronym strains itself, being mindful in the conversation. Remember mindfulness? Talked about it, one thing at a time. This is a self-description that's inside of your own head a little bit to keep focused on what is happening right now. Don't allow yourself to get frustrated and distracted to other problems, particularly other problems that you've had with this person, because that can happen. Now, there's another thing that you have to keep in mind here with mindfulness. Remember, mindfulness is doing one thing at a time, staying focused on the present. You might find that other people in the world struggle with communication. It's not just you, it's other people. It's not just people who watch these videos and try to better themselves. It's not even people who tend to be very, very emotional. There are lots of people out there in the world who don't communicate very well or very effectively, and they will have trouble staying mindful. So part of staying mindful is to keep it in your own mind. What are we talking about right now? What is the purpose? What are my needs in this one conversation right now that I'm having in the present? And if I start to go off, I'll help to kind of control myself by focusing. If the other person starts to go off track, maybe they start to attack me, they start to physically call the cops, but maybe they start to, oh, hey, you just want to raise because you're big, lazy, good for nothing. And that's not helpful. Now, rather than just end the conversation, being mindful gives me some tools that I can use. There's a couple tricks to try to help the other person remain mindful in the conversation as well. One of those is actually one of my favorites. It's called the broken record. Broken record in the terms of communication is when you pick something. You pick one position or one statement that you can make back to the person. Let's say I want to talk about the raise. Once again, I keep using this as an example. And my boss is like, well, you remember last month, blah, blah, blah. Or, hey, what about this other thing that happened that's totally off topic? And I'm going to gently play the broken record technique, which is, well, I understand what you're saying, but I really want to talk about how I think I deserve a raise. And I'm going to actually take that statement. Let's say that's my broken record safety statement. I'm just going to, whenever it's my turn to talk, I'm going to keep saying that until he rejoins the current conversation. If he's going, well, yeah, blah, 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 and I'm like, okay, well, I really want to stay focused on this issue of the raise, though. I might vary the words a little bit if it's the kind of situation in which I don't want to offend the person, because it might seem a bit rude, but I'm going to essentially keep that boundary and use that broken record if I'm using this technique. It works really well, actually, with people who are manipulative and are a little on the abusive side, except in that case, I wouldn't worry about being rude. I would just pick the phrase and I would say, I'm not going to fight about that with you. And if I have to repeat that 20 times, that's better than me trying to engage in whatever distraction or tangent they want me to. One of the things that's important is when we're under stress, we're not very clever because we go into anxiety mode. And so a broken record allows us to not have to be super clever because I can just say the same thing. Other part of that helps the other person stay mindful is just straight up ignoring. Ignoring the person if it's an extreme situation where they're being verbally abusive or something. But more often when it's not, if I'm talking to my boss and he goes off on some kind of tangent and says, hey, well, you remember Jimmy who used to work here? Man, that guy was in here asking me for a raise all the time. And rather than take the bait and say, you're comparing me to Jimmy? Is that what you're doing? You're comparing me to Jimmy? Let me give you 500 reasons why that comparison isn't fair. And him going, well, it's not fair, but it is fair about the things that matter. And I wasn't saying this. Well, I think you were because you said that. And all of a sudden we're fighting about Jimmy or whoever that is. What I'm actually going to do instead is ignore that bait. And I'm just going to go, and I'm going to go back to the conversation that I'm having with you right now and not rise to that. It's a really good thing to do if anybody says anything that is attacking and then says, oh, well, are you just blah, 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 something that I find offensive. If they didn't intend offense, it's great to ignore it and move on. In fact, if they did intend to offend me, there are times where that's also useful to just ignore that and move on. Now, saying that, I don't think that you have to accept that kind of behavior from anyone. If somebody is going to start insulting you directly and calling you names, that's also a good time. If you don't want to use ignoring is fine. Ignoring the name calling and saying, let's go back to the topic at hand. That's more aggressive ignoring, though, where you're telling them, I'm not going to sit here and trade insults with you. You could also say, you could also use the description technique and say, you're starting to insult me, and I don't think that's going to go anywhere. And ultimately, if they won't stop, you can end the conversation. Not every conversation can be saved by the D.E.A.R.M.A.N technique. The last one is, the last one is not the one we're doing. Appearing confident. This goes into, there's a video that I made on this YouTube channel, also broadcasted as a podcast, which is behaving confidently. Confidence is action-based, and you can watch that whole thing if you want to hear my whole take on it. But basically, it's using monitoring your nonverbal and verbal communication to say, am I communicating the image of confidence? So I would encourage you to watch that if you want to learn more about that. I talk a lot about some ways to act confident that actually translate to really having confidence, not only fooling the person. But keep in mind that they can't read your mind. And so if you appear confident, they're going to think that you are. Last one, flexibility. It's actually negotiation, but flexibility is my definition of that. There's a lot of evidence that psychological flexibility and our expectations is actually one of the major keys to happiness in our life. If we are open to other things happening, if we're open to compromise, if we're open to talking about things. And so if I'm coming in wanting a raise from my boss and he offers me a counter offer and I say no, because it's not the thing I asked for, that's a certain way to take it, but it's not as effective as maybe saying, let's talk about your counter offer. Why are you offering me that? And does this lead to what I want? And does this have anything to do with it? And is it something that I would like? Because then I can negotiate around that. Being willing to negotiate to a certain extent, if you're going to engage in a difficult conversation with someone, in most cases, you should be willing to negotiate something and compromise something, or else you're setting yourself up for disappointment. There are extremes going back to the abusive, manipulative people that we're not really sort of talking about. But if we're in that situation where the only thing I'm going to say is I'll never talk to you again because you've been abusing me, and I'm going to lay down, you know, whatever. Yeah, I mean, then that's pretty inflexible, and that's appropriate. But in most situations where I'm just asking for something or trying to communicate a need to someone, being willing to negotiate and compromise is something that can be very helpful. So there you have it. Dear Man. And I want to say one more thing about Dear Manning that is really important. Dear Manning, of course, is an NFL player. There we go. That's what I'm talking about. All right. Dear Man, once again, is describing, asserting, reinforcing. Oh, sorry. Expressing. Describing, expressing, asserting, reinforcing, remaining mindful during that time, maintaining an appearance of confidence, and being willing to negotiate. And if it seems like this is 7 skills rolled into one, then you are very perceptive in noticing that I said 7 earlier, because it actually is 7 skills. Here's how you actually use this, okay? Write it down or download the cheat sheet that I have, or look up dbtselfhelp.com, you know, have a worksheet there or whatever. Practice thinking about it in these terms when you're not having the conversation. What are the 7 things I should keep in mind during a tough conversation or a conversation in which I'm going to ask for something? Dear Man, that's what they are. Look them over before you're in the situation, okay? The other thing that I would suggest is that if you're in a position where this is coming up for you a lot, you're either having a lot of difficult, conflicty type of conversations, or you're in a position where you have to ask for things a lot, pick 1 or 2 of these 7 parts of Dear Man and focus on that 1 or 2, okay? The next time you have that conversation, focus on that one thing, those 2 things, whatever it is that you feel speaks to you the most. You probably, listening to this right now, have already keyed into a couple of things that are more difficult for you and a couple of things that are easier for you. And so focus on either of those, really. Build up the areas where you're strong and try to work on some of those areas where you're a little bit weaker. And that can help. If you try to tackle all 7 equally in every difficult conversation you have, you'll very quickly burn out and say, this is the stupidest thing I've ever tried to do. I'm not going to do it anymore. So don't do that to yourself, because you deserve better than that. So be mindful, be kind to yourself, and, you know, give yourself a break in there. Yeah, that's all for the DBT skill for today. You can check out this video and all of the DBT skill videos here on the YouTube channel, or you can go over to my website, dwighthurst.com, and link to groups there, or link to videos. It'll have, it'll show you where it's at and show you how to get there. Thanks a lot, and have a wonderful, wonderful, mindful, Dear Manny type of day. Thanks a lot.